Hello and welcome to Honors American History, Chapter 29. This chapter talks about Woodrow Wilson and him as the progressive president of the Democratic Party through 1912 election until 1916, talking about his reelection and entrance into World War I. First and foremost, at the end of the previous chapter, chapter 28, we're talking about how William Howard Taft, the Republican president, and the past Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, were having issues getting along. Theodore Roosevelt did not believe that Taft was upholding the ideas of progressivism as well as he could have. And so this chapter opens with the Republican Party being split. Roosevelt comes to the Republican National Convention and believes that he can step right back into politics. He wants to be the Republican candidate in 1912 election. After much deliberation, the Republicans state that they're going to stick with William Howard Taft. Their best chance at winning the White House is sticking with their candidate. And this angers Roosevelt immensely. So much so that he creates his own political party, the Progressive Party. And in the course of creating this Progressive Party, he has a couple of debates, and one of his first major rallies and speaking to a crowd, he is shot in the chest as he's walking up to the stage by a low caliber bullet. The man that shot him is arrested and taken away. And Roosevelt, who is urged to seek medical attention, says, "No, this is my first campaign speech coming back. There's been questions about my health. I can't cancel this." So he stuffs the wound with handkerchiefs and he walks up to the stage. And the stage, he gets up there and he's trying to talk over people, but it's so loud that he can't get their attention. Reportedly, he had to usher somebody up to quiet the crowd. And his opening line to the crowd was, "My friends, I don't know that you know this or not. I have just been shot." And rumorably, the whole place just kind of falls to a pin drop because everybody's amazed. Very few are aware of what has actually happened. And so once it falls to a pin drop, he pulls out of his breast pocket where he had been shot his speech, and they believe the low caliber bullet was slowed down enough by the folded paper to not be a lethal shot, and it just embedded in his chest. And so as he pulls out his speech that has a bullet hole in it and blood stains, he says, "Luckily, it takes more than a single bullet to take down a bull moose." And he had made the reference of bull moose a couple of times. When he was questioned about his health, he said, "I am as healthy as a bull moose." And so with his speech saying it takes more than a bullet to take down a bull moose, it solidifies the nickname of the new Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. And so he will run under that banner. And William Howard Taft will continue to run under the Republican banner, getting their nomination. And the Democratic candidate will be Woodrow Wilson. So, a little background. We know a little bit about Roosevelt. We know a little bit about Taft. Woodrow Wilson is kind of an unknown so far. So the Democrats have not won a major election since the 1880s as far as the presidency. And they're trying to get into the Oval Office. And they select Dr. Woodrow Wilson. And he is a very academic individual, doctor as in PhD, not medical. He was a governor of New Jersey. He was the Princeton University president. He himself was a very accomplished man already, and he gets the nomination for the Democratic Party. And once he gets up to that stage, he runs on the platform that he calls the New Freedom. Okay, New Freedom is a direct contradiction to Roosevelt's platform, the New Nationalism, which we'll get into here in just a second. His New Freedom was a huge favor to small enterprise. He wanted to break all trusts. All trusts were uniformly bad in his eyes. There weren't good, there weren't bad, they were all bad. And he didn't like the idea of social welfare programs like minimum wage, like workman's compensation. He did not like those ideas in American workplace. New Freedom based itself on tearing down the triple wall of privilege, which we will talk about a little bit more in depth in a couple of slides. But the triple wall of privilege was trusts, tariffs, and high finance or banks. And that's going to be his focus, is to try to elevate everybody by allowing those three walls to be torn down so that they can burst out of their socioeconomic status and explore new options. So while he's campaigning about the new freedom, Teddy Roosevelt's going to be campaigning on new nationalism. So the two of them are going to be the two major deliberators. As soon as Teddy Roosevelt creates the Bull Moose Party and runs, he becomes the forerunner because he's going to take the majority of the Republican votes with him. And so it's really going to be running between a third party, Teddy Roosevelt, and the Democratic Party with Woodrow Wilson. So new nationalism in direct opposition to new freedom. New nationalism, the best way that I can put it, it's the same ideas, it's the same feelings, it's the same platitudes as the square deal that Teddy Roosevelt ran on in 1904 for his reelection. And new nationalism is going to throw a couple of new wrinkles in there, but along those same ideas. He still wants to protect the environment. He still wants to conserve the environment. He still wants to protect the consumer. He still wants to tame corporations. The three C's of the square deal are still very much at the heart of new nationalism. And new nationalism will expand on those by saying that we need to campaign for women's suffrage. We need to campaign for minimum wage. We need to have a social insurance. And he doesn't really describe what he means by social insurance, but it branches off in two ways. The first of which comes through in workman's compensation in this chapter, and the second comes through in his grandnephew when FDR takes president, the Social Security and the Old Age Pension Act that will come through as that. So these three presidents are going to be campaigning in 1912 to win their election. Woodrow Wilson will emerge as the victor. He will receive 435 of the electoral votes. Teddy Roosevelt will get 88, and Taft will get 8. Now, this seems like a huge victory, but Woodrow Wilson is what we consider a minority president. He did not get the majority of the popular vote, although he got 435 of the electoral votes, which is what elects the president. 41% of the popular vote went to Woodrow Wilson. So we got to ask, how does he only win, or how does he win with only 41% of the popular vote? Well, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft took the same voting base. They basically pulled from the Republican Party and split it in half. And so they only had half as many votes in many states as Woodrow Wilson, if you're talking about equal numbers. There was a fourth candidate, Eugene Debs, ran as the socialist candidate and got almost 1 million votes. And that's kind of scary that the Socialist Party has that much backing at this point. William Howard Taft is going to lose a humiliating loss with only 8 electoral votes as the sitting president. And it would be very easy for him to just kind of sift back into the footnotes of history, but he comes back to be appointed to the Supreme Court and becomes the only U.S. president, the only person in U.S. history to serve as president of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So at 2 separate times in his life, he held the highest position in 2 of the 3 branches of government. Woodrow Wilson, as an idealist, he was an academic, and so he really enjoyed talking about the ideas and theories behind what's going on. He was the first person from the South since the Civil War to be elected to this office. He was a great speaker. He had this sense that he was morally right. His moral compass seemed to point in the right direction. But on the downside, he was a very cold personality. He, in conversation with people, unless he deemed you as an equal intellect, if he thought you were dumber than he was, he'd be very cold and off-putting. But if you were seen as an equal or higher intellect, he would seem very enthusiastic and embrace the conversation. One more thing about about Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was a very stubborn individual, and he could be almost obstinate and aggressive in his negotiations. He did compromise. If he was presented with facts contrary to what his beliefs were, he would compromise. And we credit that to Teddy Roosevelt. He was a compromiser when compromising was needed. Woodrow Wilson was not a compromiser. He was very much, this is the line of facts. I know the information. It is my way or the highway. And he would not compromise. He would break before he would compromise. And we'll see examples of that throughout this chapter, but next chapter is going to be the big one that we'll talk about as to why it's a major character flaw for Woodrow Wilson to not bend at times when we're talking about the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. So, one of the first things that Woodrow Wilson wants to tackle under his new freedom plan is to bring down that triple wall of privilege. He wants to attack the tariff. So you got the infographic on the right-hand side here that shows how a one-way tariff works. So the United States and Great Britain, we have a similar product in cloth, as the example is here. So a cloth roll that's American-made costs $4 a roll. To you, the consumer, buying it off the shelf, it's $4. In Great Britain, they make it, they ship it over here, and presumably without the tariff, it costs $4. And so the consumer then has to choose. Do you want American-made product? Do you want British? Maybe the British has a new pattern that you like, or maybe the American has a different color that you like. But it's really up to the consumer to determine which one they want. Now, to protect American industry, you don't want that competition. You don't want an equal playing ground, especially for a young or developing industry. So in order for this to tip the tide to Americans to buy American-made goods and American products, we implement a tariff, a 25% tariff, according to the infographic here, which will add $1 to the British-made cloth. So now it costs $5 off the shelf. And now you have American consumers that are going to look at it and say, $4 American-made, $5 British-made. Do I really like the British-made stuff that much to buy a bolt of cloth that costs $1 more? Probably not. I'm going to buy the American made. And what this does is it gives the American industry more favor in the American economy. And if you buy the British made good, then we're gaining tax money off of tariff tax money off of that sale. The problem with tariffs is it doesn't just work one way. The United States puts tariff on British cloth. It's likely that within a year or maybe even less, that Great Britain will put a tariff on American cloth, because you don't just want to sell in America, you want to sell abroad. And so then you have a tariff going both ways, which really inspires both countries to not buy foreign-made good. And it's not just cloth then it's corn and it's beef and it's automobiles and it's oil, and you start putting tariffs on every good, or maybe a flat rate of all goods coming out of this country are set at 30% tariff. And so what that will do over the course of time is slow international trade, so that nobody really is inspired to trade with each other. And Wilson sees this as a major problem. There's tariffs everywhere, and it's stifling American trade. And so he helps come up with the idea that tariffs need to be reduced, and is largely responsible for the passage of the Underwood Tariff Act in 1913. Which is the legal terminology, the legal writing of the 16th Amendment. We pass the 16th Amendment, we ratify it, and we implement a income tax. And so now people are taxed based upon what they make, what their income is. And that income tax will replace the tariff money coming in. So Great Britain's being taxed 25% off of this cloth. That 25% extra would go to the federal government. That's what they'd use to operate. And so now with the 16th Amendment and the Underwood Tariff, we are exchanging the tariff, and now income tax is going to be what funds the federal government. And the Underwood Tariff Act, like I said, is just how it's worded legally in law from Congress. So every time we pass an amendment, it just doesn't become law because it's an amendment. We have to write it up and have the terminology match what we want it to do. The second real thing that Wilson wanted to attack was high finance, as he called it, or the banks. Problem was with the banks that after the Civil War, we had the Civil War National Banking Act, and there was a lot of bad things about this. First of all, it was inelastic. There was no flexibility to the economy, that there was only to ever be so much money circulated in. And if there's ever any more, it was still had to fit within the non-fluid box. Many times the Fed would publish, or they print money, and they'd send it to individual banks, and they'd allow the individual banks to determine when it was necessary to issue that money. But in their mind, there was still X amount of money out there. Problem was they didn't take into consideration how different economies through different regions work. So like Midwest, the Southwest Nebraska, Northwest Kansas, up into South Dakota, over to Missouri, our economy is way different than coastal Massachusetts, Virginia. Their economy, some will fluctuate very greatly depending on tariffs, depending on trade. Midwestern economy stays pretty even keel all the way. And so on the East Coast, they might need more money issued, and there might not be anything. They might have issued all of that money, and in the Midwest, there hasn't been really a need, and they still have a stockpile. And in the eyes of the Fed, there's still money out there to be issued, so they won't issue anything new. And there's a lot of other things that cause major panic, with Roosevelt trying to manipulate part of the banking system in the economy in 1907. So after Wilson takes over, you have him take the initiative to investigate what's going on, what needs to change. Okay. Consider he's an academic. He doesn't want to just make a knee slap reaction. He wants to see what the real problem is and then explore options. So the first thing he does is he has an investigation by Senator Aldrich, and looks into the establishment of a third bank of the United States, saying that there needs to be a third entity. And what comes out of that is it's not really a great idea to have a third bank of the United States. And it just gets, the power seems to drift further and further away from the central government. There needs to be something else. The second part of the investigation is that Arseni Pujo, a congressman, says that there's a money monster, that somewhere it seems that money is just being siphoned away from the economy. And that's your trusts and big corporations that are just kind of pigeonholing money away, that in certain banks that the money is just being put into vaults, and they're not even talking about it being available in case they need the money for a rainy day. And then the third part of the investigation is Louis D. Brandeis has this idea that American finances of the time and bankers were not working for the people, they were working for self-interest. So in June of 1913, Woodrow Wilson is going to address Congress and ask them to create some form of new banking structure. And he says, here's the information that has been gathered. It's needed. It needs to happen. And so what they come up with later in 1913 is the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, which creates a board that oversees all banking in the United States. But that's such a large area that they have to break the United States into 12 separate districts. And these districts will oversee their area and report back to the Federal Reserve Board. And that way, yes, it's removed, the power structure is removed, but everything comes back to one central structure. And this central bank, the Federal Reserve Board, has the power to issue real paper money and oversee the flow of currency. That paper money is called a Federal Reserve note. If you ever look at the front side with the face of the president or famous historical figure on your monetary note, you'll notice the top banner says Federal Reserve Note. And that's just a standardized money issued by the Fed or the Federal Reserve Board. So here's your 12 banking districts across the United States. As you can see here in McCook, Nebraska, we are in District 10. Federal Reserve District number 10. The black marks are the Federal Reserve District headquarters, and the red marks are the sub headquarters. So like in Omaha and Colorado, Denver, and Oklahoma City, there are sub-district headquarters. Finally, Woodrow Wilson, as a part of his triple wall, wants to tame the trusts. So in 1914, he, pleading with Congress, passes the Federal Trade Commission Act, where the Federal Trade Commission is established. The Federal Trade Commission's job is to oversee trading that's going on, to make sure that there's no illegal acquisitions of companies, that there's no illegal mergers, to stop trusts from forming and from harming the economy, that the economy should still flow. You can't have any false advertising. You can't have bribery happening for one company to not take over this company. They oversee a lot of stuff going on. And today they oversee also the stock market and trading. And in 1914, there's also the Clayton Antitrust Act that's passed to beef up the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in the 1880s. Sherman Antitrust Act said that trusts were illegal, but it was really difficult because there wasn't a lot of great verbiage. Nobody knew how to define a trust at that point. Clayton Antitrust Act then also says that labor unions cannot be called trusts. They are not trusts. They are not in control of it. And so it allows labor unions to exist and to petition and picket and do the things that they do to try to fight for the rights of their members. And Samuel Gompers calls the Clayton Antitrust Act the Magna Carta, or the founding document that allows rights to labor unions. He says it's one of the first pieces of legislation that actually looks at labor unions and says you are allowed to exist. As a matter of fact, you are encouraged to exist. So that's where I'm going to leave off today with the first edition of Chapter 29 lecture. I'll be back with another edition